Hello and welcome to lesson number 55 in our micro series in Lockdown 3, and today is the 27th of March 2021 and we're going to be looking at study number 55 in the book of 60 by Feuillard. This one is another one which describes itself as for arpeggios, but this time on 4 strings, whereas a few days ago we looked at the study on 3 strings. Now the previous study on 3 strings, because you were only ever using 3, whether the lower 3 or the upper 3, there's a lot more variation in what the bow pattern could be. And as you'll know if you've had a look at that study, I actually gave you the fundamental bow patterns as they changed for every single line of the 11 lines that are printed there. So in respect of the difference between that study and this one being on all 4 strings is much more simple in terms of the bow pattern. Basically you're going to go across all the strings and back again, one way or the other. Now there are variations of bowing printed at the bottom. There are 6 variations. So if we consider what we've got, the printed study itself has a triplet solution. Kind of feel. It does say whole bow, so maybe more like it depends on the speed at which you want to take it, and I think that in that triplet version we can't get that much faster. If you had a look however at variation 1, this is then using all 4 strings in a single stroke and then back again, might describe as a bow wave, and that one with the whole bow, you could see you could, with a bit of a sort of a floaty flautando kind of sound, you could travel through the whole bow at a fast speed. Let's just see how that feels in terms of a stopped note. So you can see you could do fairly fast speed full bows for variation 1, and the feeling you find in that is a little kick at each end of the bow as you change direction across the string. Very different to the triplet feel. Let's just try that one, full bows. Something like that. Now variation 2 takes the triplet variation that is printed, but this time looking at 6 notes in a bow. Now this is actually quite an interesting challenge because it means you're also practicing going on an up bow from the lower strings. So we have first, then up, same thing. So you're getting a different feeling in the arm, and I think that one's a really interesting variation to try. The third variation, it looks deceptively straightforward. It's just separate bows, middle of the bow staccato. But there's something about it, the way it's written in triplets, that just feels slightly against the grain, where we've got the up here. It can just feel, for some reason, just slightly out of kilter with what you're expecting, and I think it's actually from the way it's written in compound time. I didn't think about this until now, but you could of course begin that up. Actually, I'm just toying around with it right now, I think actually that could feel more comfortable. So if there's an idea, and depending on what you're studying, that might be one that's of use to you to support some piece of repertoire that you're working on. The 4th study variation, it's again staccato, but because you're using a group of 4 there and back, I think it's mentally much more straightforward. Something like that. So you really are just feeling much more, I think, that the pull and push in terms of this sort of horizontal movement is where the mind gets focused. Then we have 2 more variations of the bow. Variation 5 is really probably more of a left-hand preparation. Now you might have noticed that I'm beginning my first bar in half position, and that's so that it fits with the changing shapes, which are definitely explored throughout the whole study. So to my mind it seemed a good idea to start in half position as you mean to go on. So variation 5 would be splitting the chord. Etc. So you're learning to really understand the two halves of the chord, and potentially, I suppose, to also have a little bit more time to hear them resounding together, whether they're exactly where you want them to be. The final variation of bowing, and obviously sort of time configuration, is where you have a very fast acciaccatura grace note for the bottom two. And really this is, aside from strong left hand, this is really training the arm for a fairly quick move to the upper two strings, so that you really understand the angular change from the lower to the upper pair of strings. So they've all got something to offer, those variations. Now looking at the main study itself, so we've thought about bow ideas and that this is going to flow, this sense of three. I mean, I think I quite favour playing with a fairly a good amount of bow, but not necessarily the whole bow if you want to have the tempo that flows. It's up to the individual. And in terms of the left hand, there are a few places where you might be caught out for the patterns, and it's not always repetitive, the sequence of chords. So for example, the first line, you have a C major, then you have an augmented chord, and then you go to the relative minor, A minor, and then A major, first inversion. And you might think, okay, I now get the kind of the feeling and the sound of what those chords are, but it does not do the same sequence on the next line. So instead it starts on D minor, it moves to relative major in a second inversion, it moves to augmented, and then it moves to a G minor chord, second inversion. So what I'm trying to really relay there is that there isn't a predictability about the chords sequence. The other thing you may be caught out by is the occasional enharmonic note, and your brain might just think you've got to shift, and you don't. So from bars 9 to 10, you've got E flat going to D sharp, so that's one to watch out for. So we've got a D sharp at the bottom. Not too bad, that one. But the one maybe you'd be more likely to fall into trap over, and that is between bar 14 and bar 15. So bar 14, we have an augmented chord, and there's a good number of these. And then it's E sharp, so stay put. You're on an F at the bottom, call it the same. E sharp, and then F sharp. So there are two reasons why you may be fooled into thinking you need to move at this point. One of them is just mentally seeing the augmented chord with an F natural at the bottom to seeing E sharp. That E sharp at the bottom there is actually masquerading, the whole chord is masquerading as a D flat major chord, but presented as C sharp major first inversion. And you know, so there's something about the unfamiliarity of those notes and recognising what they are as a chord. There is another reason why you may fall into the trap of wanting to shift, and that is, up until this point there's been an even predictability about where you're going. So we've had a couple of bars, if I'd say take from bar 9, you had a couple of bars where we had sounding note E flat at the bottom for 2 bars, then E natural twice, and then F 3 times. If we're counting the E sharp, it's the same position. We've got 3 bars of that, and then again 3 bars of F sharp, followed by everything else from a G at the bottom. Now if this makes no sense, I think it does make more when you look at the manuscript and have tried it and realise you're falling into some traps. And here's a potential useful idea. you could play the beginning note of every bar just to see how the sequence pans out. So we have C 3 times, C sharp, and then we go to D 4 times, 2 E flats, 2 E naturals, call it 3 F naturals, although the last one here is an E sharp, then F sharp 3 times, then G's to the end, and then a C at the very end. So I think that's actually not a bad idea, because this is training your brain and hand to understand what the root of each chord is in terms of where your left hand is and how many times you're going to be staying on that very important fundamental note. Anything else of particular interest? No, probably not. I mean, the other places that you might potentially fall into traps are where we are shifting a fifth across but shifting at the same time. So for example, at the end of the second line, maybe because it's on a broken line, it could potentially trip you up. Okay, let's give it a go. Now there is, I mean, you can hear a fair few surprise chords in there. I think particularly for me, I think is on the last line where you have the augmented chord to an E minor first inversion. It's just a bit unexpected, and I think that's where these studies can sometimes challenge us, because what you're predicting doesn't happen, and then you sort of find yourself adjusting to what you hear. Even me. Have a go. I think this one's quite an interesting one, and all the variations of bowing offer something different to how you feel with regard to the pendulum action of the elbow or the speed of angle change, etc.